Welcome back to Lecture 2 in Game Design Theory. In the first video, we talked very broadly about the model we've introduced so far and about game mechanics specifically as a layer of game design. And in this video, we're going to take a deeper dive into one particular family of mechanics to explore the depth and the breadth of just looking at some very specific kinds of mechanics and how they all interact with game design and with each other. So in this video, we're going to talk about uncertainty mechanics. And this is something that is introduced in great detail in the book Uncertainty in Games by Greg Costikyan, which is highly recommended. Costikyan introduces uncertainty as a necessary component of games and of play in general. He considers games as occupying the kind of middle level between full predictability and full unpredictability, in the sense that activity which is fully predictable is not going to hold our interest because there's nothing interesting about it. But an activity that's fully chaotic and fully unpredictable is also going to be not interesting because it's we can't affect any change in that world if it's truly chaotic. What holds our attention the most is having an environment which has rules and things going on that we don't quite know yet, but over time, as we develop our own knowledge of the game world, we can start learning them and figuring them out, and then affecting the state of the world in order to control them. And a number of different designers have proposed different kinds of theories around this. For example, this matches with Ralph Koster's theory of what makes games fun, in which he proposes that fun is learning. And sure enough, learning about the game and figuring out the game is a huge aspect of enjoyment in many game types. But in here, we're going to focus specifically on Costikyan's model and specifically on his understanding of uncertainty. So we're going to start with examples. They are straight from the book, but as I mentioned, I would recommend checking out the source material because it is the discussion there is very good. So Costikyan distinguishes a number of different types of uncertainty. The first one that is going to be most obvious to everybody is so-called performative uncertainty, which is, how do I even do anything? If you pick up a controller in a game like Mario and you try to do something, you will learn how to jump pretty quickly by pressing the right buttons. But how to jump well and how to jump over obstacles of increasing difficulty is more difficult. That's where the challenge begins. So a lot of learning how to play a game like this is to learn how to overcome the obstacle of just not knowing how to do things, not conceptually, but like how to make yourself learn how to do this, how to train yourself in order to be able to cross the right obstacles, attack enemies correctly, and so on. Costikyan calls it performative uncertainty. Uncertainty around being able to do something. The flip side of it, the more conceptual element related to this, is solver's uncertainty, which is the not knowing how to conceptually solve a puzzle in front of you. This is not a performance issue because the actually performing the action is not difficult. The difficulty is knowing what the solution is. So this is something that shows up in action and adventure games such as Curse of Monkey Island, for example. Then games like this is an example of a hidden object game called Garden of Time, which is an uncertainty that stresses your ability to perceive things, not perform and not think, but perceive. So in a game like this, the world is full of noise, and your ability to find things under time pressure is being tested. can I find what I'm looking for quickly enough is a kind of a perception uncertainty. On the other hand, a game like first-person shooter, whether it's this Counter-Strike right here, for example, or any of the other ones, introduces the uncertainty of dealing with other people. So far, we've only been talking about the player themselves and the environment, but once we introduce other people into the equation, uncertainty goes through the roof, because other people are not only unpredictable, kind of, but also they have their own agency, and they have their own goals and ideas. So we call this player unpredictability. What is the other player going to do? And it's a huge aspect of, for example, sports, competitive multiplayer games, and so on. And of course, in games like FPSs, there will be performance uncertainty as well, because even though you know that somebody's shooting at you, that doesn't mean that you necessarily know how to shoot them back. Costikyan also goes into a game like rock paper scissors to talk about player unpredictability, because rock paper scissors is kind of like a distilled version of that, right? The action space is tiny. You can only guess one of 3 different actions, and because of that, rock paper scissors is also not very interesting, because there is the unpredictability there is not really an interesting psychological puzzle. It's trying to kind of figure out what the other player is thinking, but not really. Compared to something like diplomacy, which is mechanically it's more complex, but also the rules of the game are set up such that they allow a lot of diplomacy between different players, and by introducing that, they really complicate player unpredictability. Diplomacy is infamous for ruining friendships, because people will backstab each other ruthlessly, and then not forget about that after the game is over. Another thing that's kind of interesting that these kinds of games introduce is hidden information, right? In sports, most information is very explicit. You can see everybody involved, and you know where the tokens at play are. Maybe you can't perceive them very well, but they're not hidden. But in a board game and card games, some important information is just not available to you. People will hold their cards to their chest, or they will hide other elements of the information, and you kind of try to figure out what it is, what are those elements that they're hiding from you. A board game like Monopoly, in addition to maybe some hidden information, maybe some player unpredictability, also introduces a classic version of uncertainty, which is randomness. Dice are a huge part of board games, of especially a certain type of board games, because they introduce unpredictability and uncertainty, but of a very specific type. It's an uncertainty of how a random process is going to behave, given a very specific distribution, right? When you roll 2 dice together, you kind of know what the distribution is going to look like. It's going to be most likely a 7, least likely a 2 or a 12, but where exactly you're going to fall in there is going to be unpredictable. A lot of board games, especially for kids, rely on randomness as a source of uncertainty, and there is some player unpredictability. But to be honest, the strategic optimization in Monopoly is pretty clear, so it's pretty clear how players are going to behave. Compared to something like chess, which is almost the opposite. There is 0 randomness. It's a fully deterministic game, but everything about the other player is unknown. How are they going to play? What are they going to do? Unless you're a high-level player, you will not be able to know or predict what other players are going to do. And even if you can, there's another kind of uncertainty that Costikyan analyzes, which is analytical complexity. You know what the rules of the game are. You know what the best move will be. It's going to take you a while to figure it out, and it might be even too hard. A huge part of the game is figuring out how to analyze the situation quickly, so that you can make the correct analysis and respond in time. This kind of analytical complexity is also present in simulation games and strategy games. Roller Coaster Tycoon is a good example of high analytic complexity because you have to learn the rules of the simulation. Those rules are also hidden from you, and you have to coax the game into revealing them. And of course, there's just enough randomness to make it fun, to make it not be a completely predictable simulation. Compared to something like roulette, which is all about randomness, and there's no simulation, there is no strategic complexity about roulette, right? This is a game of chance, and your participation in the game comes down to understanding distributions of what are the chances of landing. What are the chances that the random process will give you a specific winning result, and analyzing player unpredictability and other players, and analyzing the odds of, if you put your bet on this particular element, what are the payouts going to be. This is a stationary randomness. It's a stationary random process in the sense that the results of the random process are not affected by the history of the random process. So if roulette landed on a 6 on this time around, it doesn't affect the number that is going to land on in the next roll. It could be anything. It could be the 6. It could be anything else. There's no time effect between one random event and another. This is very different from something like poker, right? In poker, randomness is non-stationary. If you draw the ace of hearts from the deck, you know that you've drawn the ace of hearts and your other players do not have it. So a lot of the interesting elements in games like poker and in games that have a non-stationary random process comes from analyzing the probabilities, how probabilities change over time, right? And players who, for example, know how to count cards use this to their advantage. They will remember which cards have already shown up and use this to analyze what cards are still in the deck and what cards could possibly be in the hands of other players. And this is why casinos, when they have card games, they do not rely on a single deck. They mix together a large number of decks in order to make it impossible for high-level players to memorize, to remember what cards have been played and predict the future. But this distinction between stationary and non-stationary randomness is kind of crucial, right? One kind of randomness is not going to change over time, versus the other one will change over time, and those require different kinds of understanding. And poker, of course, has player unpredictability and a large amount of hidden information which the player is trying to figure out. Roguelikes are a good example of a game that has not just performative uncertainty and hidden information, but also kind of randomness that results in procedural generation. So it's not just that the distribution of cards in the deck is going to change, it's that the shape of the world is going to change based on a random process. And that is interesting because you have to figure out how the randomness affects the process that generates the world, so you can try to predict in the future what would be the best way to go about this, to go about achieving your goals. Real life games, so games that impact the player's world outside of the game, are kind of interesting too, because they introduce uncertainty related to this kind of interaction. Social games of yesteryear, like Cityville and Farmville, would introduce demands on the player's real-life schedule and test their ability to meet them. So, for example, they would in a game like Cityville or Farmville, you would plant crops, and those crops would be ready in 4 hours of real time, not game time, and they would wither in 8 hours of real time. So you had that window of 4 hours, and depending on how you planned your day, you might realize that that window is between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. And there's nothing you can do about this. You're going to come back to the game and all your crops will be withered. So it really stresses the player's ability to manage the intersection between game time and in-game behavior and their out-of-game real-world situation. Another thing that those games introduce is the idea of game evolution. So games like these are not static, but they change over time. And the rules of the game may change, the elements of the game may change, and they stress the player's ability to predict and adjust themselves to the changing game world. And of course, there will be player unpredictability. Since it's a multiplayer game, there will be a lot of hidden information because the player does not know what's going on until they discover it. Compared to something like a strategy game like Memoir 44, which has a number of different kinds of randomness sources, but it does not really impact the player's life outside of the game, right? The entire game is circumscribed within the state of the game board, and there will be different kinds of randomness. There are dice rolls, so there are both stationary and non-stationary random processes because of dice rolls, and also card decks. So you can try to figure out what kinds of cards have been already drawn and so on. There's going to be a lot of solvers uncertainty and just analytic complexity of trying to figure out how to deal with the situation you're in. And then we can look at computer strategy games like Civilization series, for example, which starts to pull in a large number of these elements of uncertainty. There's hidden information, there's player uncertainty, large amount of analytic complexity, a large amount of procedural generation randomness. It really stresses the player's ability to bring it all together and manage all these sources of uncertainty at the same time. And then the last example which Costikyan uses is Magic the Gathering, which is a great example of stressing not just in-game uncertainty, such as player unpredictability, analytic complexity, and so on, but also especially game evolution, because a lot of the trying to figure out how to play this game on a long term is about evolving, about both the game rule set evolving and also you changing your own deck and changing your own set of cards in response to other people, and basically changing the way you play. So this was a very large list of examples of uncertainty mechanics of different types, but it's a great list because it shows the huge variety of how uncertainty comes in a number of different flavors, and how those flavors have very different effect on the player. They challenge the player in different ways. They produce different stresses, and also they create different kinds of feeling in the player as the player interacts with them. And the one theme that Costikyan comes back to in his analysis of uncertainty is that much of the fun in games comes from mastering this uncertainty. And different kinds of uncertainty are going to produce different kinds of gameplay. If the uncertainty is about what are other players going to do, that's going to lead to very different gameplay than trying to figure out a random process or trying to figure out analytically what the game board is telling you. Another element which is interesting is this idea of layering of mechanics and layering of uncertainty. We can see that as we go through these examples, the combination of different kinds of mechanics, different kinds of uncertainty start getting more and more complex. as we get to the most complex games on the right-hand side, such as Civilization and Magic the Gathering, they will layer a large number of different mechanics together and challenge the player to solve all of them at the same time. Compared to easier games, or maybe not easier, but less demanding with regard to uncertainty. They will challenge the player in fewer ways and keep the challenge more constrained. So this can lead us in the direction of trying to figure out how do we want to harness these uncertainty mechanics in our own game design. And we can start by grouping them into sets. So for example, if the game we're making challenges the player's own skill, such as player's own performance, ability to perceive things, or ability to solve puzzles, we can help the player by letting them improve their skill, by giving them a learning opportunities and a learning curve that will gradually help them get better. In contrast, if the uncertainty in our game is centered on other players, such as player unpredictability against the human or AI enemies, we can help the player by giving them space to figure out their opponents and space to observe what other players are doing and experiment. On the other hand, if our game is heavy on randomness, whether it's stationary, such that the probabilities are always the same, or non-stationary, such that the probabilities change as you play, we can help the players by, one, giving them a clear idea of what those random elements are, not telling them distributions necessarily, but letting them analyze either from observation or from experimentation, and letting them build a mental model of how those random processes work. And as an aside, random processes can also be an interesting way to sprinkle in a little bit of dramatic tension, although that can be easy to overdo. If our game is heavy in complexity, and especially if it includes hidden information, we can help the player by letting them experiment and explore the game world and build a good model of how the world exactly works. And then if our uncertainty is heavy on anticipation, whether it's narrative or anticipating game evolution or anticipating real-life effects of the game on them, we can help the player by letting them make predictions and giving them space to fail in a safe way before we challenge them in a more difficult way, and make the future always logically flow from the past, even if the effects were not obvious. The player needs to feel like they would have been able to predict them if they had more information. And this is something that shows up in all these categories of harnessing uncertainty, whether they're based on player skill or randomness or complexity and so on. The ability to give the player space to experiment and to master their understanding of uncertainty. And how exactly this space is going to work does depend on the game, but it is crucial to let the player basically play and figure out the game for themselves. And this is where we are going to end lecture 2. Today we've covered mechanics, so the material elements of game design. These are the objects and the actions and the rule sets of games. We looked at the sheer variety of them. We looked at the differences between explicit and implicit mechanics. We looked at how different kinds of actions can impact each other and interlock and interact with each other. And we looked at a variety of different examples with the idea that we can start using them to analyze our own games as well as the games we enjoy playing, to see what kind of material components they're built out of and how those components affect the experience. So in the next lecture, we're going to look at gameplay, which is what happens when players pick up those objects and the cards, the chips, the game pieces, and they pick up the rules and start doing things in the game world. And they start interacting with the game and with each other, and it is this runtime behavior that results in gameplay, which then results in experience. And that is going to be the topic of Lecture 3. See you there.